Okay, welcome to the special seminar series. Special seminar series on the state of South Africa's electricity and water service delivery. My name is Danford Tivongotse. For those who do not know me, I'm a research fellow at the Center for Civil Society here at UKZN. Today, we have an important guest speaker, Alex Lenfena, who will talk to us about building people's power to reclaim the just energy transition. Alex, thank you for participating in this special seminar. So I will introduce Alex. Alex is a postdoctoral research fellow at Nelson Mandela University in the Department of Development Studies. And he's a recipient of the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences Fellowship. He's also the elected General Secretary and co-founder of the Climate Justice Coalition, which is a South African coalition of civil society, grassroots, trade union, and community-based organizations working together to advance a transformative climate justice agenda. Alex is a first-generation South African whose family hails from the small island nation of Mauritius. He has dedicated over 15 years to research, writing, teaching, activism on climate change. His work, writing, and research is freely available at alexlefena.com. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. I will also facilitate this seminar, so I will give you 30 to 40 minutes to give your talk on building people's power, people's resilience in reclaiming just energy transition. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk and what you guys are doing there at Climate Justice Coalition. And after that, we'll have a question and answer session. Hopefully, more people will join in. And then, we'll close the seminar after the session. Thank you again, Alex, for joining us. You may begin your talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Danford, and thanks to the UKZN Centre for Civil Society for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you all. So today, talking about the just transition, and within the description of the talk, was talking about how the term just transition and just energy transition has become something that has been kind of taken up by a lot of different actors across society, whether it's big business, government, community-based organizations, sort of more radical formations, trade unions. And everybody uses the term just transition or just energy transition on a more narrow lens. But I think, that the fact that it's been taken up so broadly in some ways is a positive sign, showing that, at least in terms of the political contestation, there's a recognition that a transition must happen and that justice should be central to it. So in some ways, I think that's the sign of progress, of movements having pushed to ensure that a just transition is a central element of discussion and that is engaged with by sectors across society. But on the other hand, what we see is that a lot of the meaning of the term just transition has kind of been captured and weakened by players that would take a term that has a much more radical history behind it, and kind of weaken the justice and weaken the strength of the transition behind it. And so here we see, for example, big business and government taking the term just transition and weakening it significantly. And maybe it's worth reflecting that, the term just transition has its histories in trade union and more leftist spaces, which talks about not just, transitioning from, dirty fossil fuel energy to renewables, but it talks more about a deep transformation of society from, a sort of capitalist extractive economy to one that's based on social and ecological justice as kind of the organizing principle. And I think it's that radical meaning of the just transition is often weakened and watered down as elites take the term and use it to serve their interests. And so this talk is very much going to be focusing on how we can reclaim that term just transition and move back to that more radical vision, particularly because it's quite important in the South African context to think about that. So maybe with that sort of introductory remark, maybe we could spend a little bit of time thinking about what are we transitioning from? Where are we now? 30 years after democracy, and what are we transitioning to when we talk about just transition, and what are the different visions that exist? And I thought in terms of context, it would be useful to kick off with a quote from Steve Biko, which seems quite relevant today as it did when he first said it. So the Biko quote is that the whites have locked up within a small minority of themselves the greater proportion of the country's wealth. If we have a mere change of face of those in governing positions, what is likely to happen is that Black people will continue to be poor, and you will see a few Blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie. Our society will be run almost as of yesterday. So for meaningful change to appear, there needs to be an attempt at reorganizing the whole economic pattern and economic policies within this particular country. And I think because words are still incredibly relevant, because what we have seen, since the dawn of democracy in South Africa has been that economic pattern that South Africa's apartheid regime built itself on hasn't been meaningfully transformed, such that a lot of the inequalities, such a lot of the injustices still exist. And I think that's in significant part because South Africa's economic system is still very heavily based and dominated by the minerals energy complex, which is big mining companies, big energy companies, kind of being at the heart of how we organize our economic policies, our industrial policies. And that hasn't shifted significantly, although there has been some interesting recent shifts in energy policy towards liberalization, which I'll talk about in a bit. But the fact that South Africa's economy is still very reliant on this minerals energy complex, which is powered predominantly by very dirty coal, and that serves extractive mining companies, many of whom export significant amounts of the mineral wealth of South Africa to overseas, means that South Africa's economy remains one of the most unequal in the world, the most unequal on some measures, and also one of the most polluting countries in the world. If you're measuring South Africa's economy, a carbon intensity per GDP, South Africa is actually one of the most polluting countries in the world, ahead of China, below just a handful of countries like Kazakhstan and Palau. So we really are one of the world's most polluting. And I think it's no accident that inequality and heavy pollution go together. You have a society whose sort of economic principle is a very extractive, rapacious sort of capitalist system that relies on exploiting both labor and the environment. You get sort of the South African economic system. And so this is kind of where, in a lot of ways, we still are. We have seen within, for example, the coal sector, some small transformation in terms of, there are, as Biko's quote suggested, some new elites at the helm of, for example, coal extraction and mineral wealth. But it's still concentrated in the hands of just a few. And I think, having just come out of elections, another way of thinking about the continued influence of the minerals energy complex and the dominance of the actors in that space is to think about who donated the most to the political parties and who therefore also has a lot of sway over our politics. So we can turn to, for example, ANC, start with the biggest one, and recognize that, their biggest donor is Patrice Motsepe, who, got a lot of his wealth from African Rainbow Minerals, which does a lot of mining and extraction and is invested in coal and other minerals extraction, as well as he also has a stake in Harmony Gold, which also donated significantly to the ANC, but also to the EFF. So EFF also got donations from Motsepe and African Rainbow Minerals. And And so the richest man on the African continent is the one that, has got his wealth from this sort of extractive economic system, and that, has a big role in driving ANC policy, as well as, donates quite heavily to the EFF now as well. And so, as much as the EFF claims that they're against, the sort of capitalist wealth that's hoarded by a few, it seems they are willing to accept funds from, particular capitalists. Yeah, so there's a question of how honest their radical critique of capitalism is, if they are willing to accept from those sorts of donors. But of course, another donor that plays a major role in this space is the Oppenheimers, who did get a lot of their wealth off the mineral extraction in South Africa, and they continue to play a major role in influencing the likes of the DA, with some entrance into Rise Mzansi as well, and Action SA, I believe, was donated by Michelle, who's a venture capitalist. And so we see the likes of who, influences our parties and funds them. We also see, for example, the ANC has its own investment wings, the Chancellor House, Bato Bato Trust, the Tebe Tebe Trust. These are investment arms that the ANC has. And if you look at who they're invested in, we see that they're also very wedded to fossil capital. They've got investments in Shell, which might explain why the ANC was so strong in advocating for Shell's interest in oil and gas exploration. They've got investments in Seriti coal mining, which might help explain why, for example, Gwede Mantashe took a bunch of youth climate activists and took them on a tour of Seriti's coal mine last year to show them the wonders of coal mining, and why coal's not such a bad thing, and why climate activists maybe should not be so down on coal. And so we see this sort of interconnection of, our political parties and the minerals energy complex, sometimes with our political parties actually being invested quite literally in companies that are enriching themselves through the extraction of wealth in South Africa. And, that influences then how our government departments behave. So, for example, we at the Climate Justice Coalition have been doing a lot of work trying to pressure the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy to drive a more just energy transition, one that truly puts social and ecological justice at its heart. But we have received major pushback from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, of threats of lawsuits, of misinformation, calling us foreign-funded forces, and really attacking us and as a way of pushing back against our influence. And I think when there's been surveys done of mining affected communities, and the way that they perceive the DMRE is as serving the interests of big corporations and mining houses over the interests of their communities. And there was also an interesting report that just came out is about to come out from the Public Affairs Research Institute. And I think it speaks a little bit to the earlier Biko quote. And it says, they basically spoke to some DMRE officials, and the DMRE officials are quite defensive of the coal industry, and partly because the ANC's broad-based Black economic employment policies, one of the places where there's been some success is in handing over ownership of coal mines to a new Black elite. Right? And the DMRE officials see part of their role as defending this new Black elite that has now invested in coal at precisely the time that the world is moving away from coal. And so the success, it's not very broad-based Black economic empowerment. It's very concentrated capital in the hands of a few. But nonetheless, this is one of the areas where there has been transfer of ownership to a new Black elite. And so there's this very interesting dynamic where coal is being protected to try to protect the new Black elite in the coal industry, and the DMRE, according to some of the surveys done by this Parry research report, sees themselves as, partly defending that and defending it against, Western climate policies, although how much of that is propaganda versus legitimate ideas of anti-imperialism is maybe something we can discuss, because it seems that sometimes the claim that Western climate policies are going to squash South Africa's energy sovereignty is a way to use propaganda to protect those that have vested interest in the coal value chain, when, in fact, South Africa could have a more prosperous economy if it invested in renewables, did so through a green industrialization pathway that created significantly more jobs, created much more broader economic opportunity and job creation. And so it's quite interesting to see how the minerals energy complex still dominates the likes of the DMRE, and the DMRE in some ways is the protector of it. And I think that's seen in how communities perceive the DMRE. So when we're thinking about, this point that we're coming from, deeply unequal, very coal heavy, polluting economy, then the question, for activists in terms of reclaiming the just transition is, where do we want to head to? Now, I think this is where the appropriation of the just transition has been really problematic, because there's been a drive to where the transition to renewables is happening. It is being driven predominantly by the private sector. And so the transition is not one that's sort of transforming our economic patterns, but is instead concentrating wealth within the private sector. And I think this particularly comes because, when the ANC started to introduce renewable energy, it did so at a time that the ANC itself was taking a turn towards neoliberalism and austerity, and that the global economic sort of ideology was taking a shift towards that, such that renewables have been introduced predominantly through either public-private partnerships or through the private sector directly, and very little socially owned or publicly owned renewables driven either by Eskom or by other forms of social ownership. And I think, particularly under the Ramaphosa administration, there's been a move for very wide-scale liberalization of the energy sector, such that there previously were limits on renewable energy, how much, for example, big mining corporations could invest in terms of renewables. They would have to apply for licenses and so on to do that. And the Ramaphosa administration just lifted those completely. And what we've seen as a result is a rush towards investment in renewable energy, both from big corporates as well as businesses that have the funds to do that, as well as more affluent households that can afford to invest in renewables. And so there is, in some ways, a sort of a lopsided transition to renewables that's happening, a lot slower than the science says we need to be doing it. But also, in terms of who gets the predominant benefits of that transition, given that it's driven predominantly by the private sector, we see that very much being concentrated in the hands of those that already have the wealth and the capital. And I think maybe thinking about why privatization is so problematic in the South African context, particularly around the energy sector, we can think about what are the things that one would need to invest in renewable energy, right? If you say we're going to leave it up to the markets, who can afford to make those investments? And the two major things you need for renewables is access to capital and access to land or property to put the renewables on. And if we look to the statistics, I mean, South Africa, in terms of the concentration of money or capital, is still, the world's most unequal country, where 10% of the population owns 80% of the wealth. That's according to the World Bank in 2022. And in terms of land, there was a 2017 land audit which said that white people still own 72% of the total farms and agricultural holdings by individual landowners, and 72% was also male-owned. And so if we think about who has the money, who has the land, it's predominantly men, it's predominantly white folk. And so if we just leave things up to the private sector, then it'll be those folks with the money and the land that will most be able to invest, most be able to benefit, and most be able to own the renewable energy future, right? And so, we see this wide-scale liberalization of the energy sector and this drive towards renewable energy driven by the private sector happening, where the state is still trying to push some renewable energy, some energy plans forward through, for example, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy's Integrated Resource Plan, which was released at the beginning of this year. There's a massive push for new gas, major gas rollouts, which goes contrary to what the climate suggests we need to be doing, which is moving away from fossil fuels as rapidly as possible. It also goes against what a lot of the government's own modeling and many independent economic modelers would say is the most affordable, job-creating, and reliable energy future for South Africa, which would be a much more renewable energy dominated future with storage. And so I think here we see the DMRE and Montashe in particular having a very strong bias towards oil and gas. And this again can be partly explained at least by their own investments in it and possible links to cadres that might benefit from these tenders, as we saw in power ships and a lot of previous energy tenders that have gone out. And then within the IRP, there's also a big move to delay the closure of coal plants by up to a decade, even though, again, government's modeling and independent modeling suggests that a more rapid shift to renewables would actually be more beneficial for South Africa, help make our energy costs lower, make our energy more reliable, and also, of course, co-benefit is reduce pollution and help us tackle the climate crisis. And so, yeah, I think what we're seeing in terms of the current transition in South Africa is, a renewables program driven predominantly by the private sector. The state's still trying to hold on to and drive fossil capital and kind of gutting the investment in renewables that the state itself is driving. And so we have a very deeply unequal transition that's happening. And the result is increased energy poverty in South Africa, because the private sector can afford to invest in renewables and therefore have more reliable, more affordable energy, whereas the vast majority of South Africans can't afford that. And so they're stuck relying on an Eskom, which it'll be interesting to see if load shedding comes back soon, but certainly Eskom's tariffs have been going up significantly due to corruption, due to forcing in expensive and polluting projects like Kusile and Medupi and a range of other projects which have driven up the cost of energy. And then, of course, the widespread corruption in Eskom that has, really pushed up the prices of our electricity that's delivered to people. And so the result is that even though, the actual electrification rates in South Africa are some of the highest in Africa in terms of people being connected to the grid, our energy poverty rates are actually quite high because even though people technically have access to electricity, they can't afford the electricity. And so, yeah, I think we're characterized in terms of our current energy transition as quite an unjust energy transition that is driving us deeper into inequality in some ways and is not moving at the speed and scale that the climate science suggests we need to be moving at. And so I think we're faced with this landscape, the fact that many of our political parties are kind of bought out by a lot of the minerals energy complex, that they are driving the sort of fossil capital vision, that are driving privatization. Both the ANC and the DA kind of have an agreement in terms of the ideological alignment that Eskom should be unbundled, that the private sector should play a bigger role. And so there is kind of this neoliberal consensus that exists with ANC and DA, which does raise some big questions about, can we drive a different type of transition that is more based on publicly owned renewable energy, socially owned renewable energy, that invests a lot more in just transition measures for workers and for coal communities than is currently being done. And that also invests a lot more in, closing the gap in those that don't have access to electricity. And I think this is where it's actually, if we look back to some of the budgets of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, the electrification program has actually stalled a little bit in South Africa. So one of the ANC's greatest achievements post-apartheid was the fact that they brought electrification rates for Black South Africans up to, from I think it was about 40% to over 80, close to 90%, which was a major achievement. But that progress has stalled partly because there's been sort of an austerity mindset, which has removed investments in electrification. But part of that is a form of what I like to call selective austerity, where there is money, but it's being spent on different priorities. So, for example, in the 2019 budget of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, they cut hundreds of millions of rands to the National Electrification Program. But at the same time, they allocated 500 million rand to research and development clean coal technologies. And I think many climate activists will point out that there's no such thing as clean coal. A lot of those technologies don't really work, and it's cheaper to actually move towards renewables. And so you can see a prioritization here of trying to keep coal going, even at the expense of electrification of households, in terms of that particular budget, as an example. So I think this points to the fact that for those of us that care deeply about climate and energy justice, we face a real uphill battle. We have major political parties that have a neoliberal outlook that are very much invested in the minerals energy complex. The DA fully committed to privatization, and so it's not really going to be in their manifesto. It's not a clear vision of how they will address the inequalities created by privatization, and the ANC, also being somewhat similarly ideologically in terms of their energy outlook. And so for us as the Climate Justice Coalition, we have been trying to drive a lot of energy and effort around pushing a more socially owned, publicly owned renewable energy future as part of a just transition, as well as thinking about how we can rebuild people's power to counteract the forces of the mineral energy complex, which are dominating our politics, which are appropriating the language of the just transition to serve their own particular interests. And I think it might be worth going back to the history of this term people's power to think a little bit about what it means to rebuild that. If we look to the history of the liberation struggles, there was a debate between those that were, in terms of legal visions, those who were constitutionalists and those who were people power constitutionalists. And basically the idea was that those who said we needed a people power state would be that the state is this vehicle for radical transformation that would serve the interests of the people, right? And then there was the constitutionalists who said, no, instead we should ground things in the constitution, and that should be the thing that guides our vision. Now, I think if you look, for example, the MK party, they've taken this people's power idea, and their vision is to kind of overturn the constitution and replace it with a different system that is based on traditional leadership. Looks pretty unaccountable and quite worrisome in terms of eroding the rights that we have. And so that's kind of a vision of people's power that maybe undermines a lot of the vision that we'd actually want in terms of enshrining ecological and social rights in how we see the future of South Africa. But there's a vision of people's power that recognizes that in order to achieve the constitutional rights enshrined in our constitution, that actually we do need a state that's driven for deep transformation given the current state of our country. And so I think there's a way to marry the constitutionalist framework with the people's power framework, recognizing that our state has currently been captured by the minerals energy complex and therefore is serving those interests predominantly in how it acts. And so in order to build the people's power state, it would have to be to reclaim the state from the capture of those interests and use it to serve social and ecological justice. And this would require deep transformation in order for us to meet, some of the rights that are enshrined in our constitution. But in order to get there, I think we do need to have a very, and Shauna was talking about how we need to have an honest conversation about the state of civil society and movements in South Africa, particularly progressive movements, because I think these elections and also the last few years have shown significant demobilization of the left, of progressive movements in South Africa. Trade unions are at some of their weakest points. Civil society is demobilized. Some of this was relatively intentional after apartheid, ANC demobilizing forces in order to, concentrate power within the political party. Other of this has just been, factionalism, infighting within progressive movements. And so we do sit at a point where progressive movements are at some of their weakest in terms of my reading of history in the last few decades. And so in order to meaningfully rebuild people's power and to recapture the state, we will need to think about how to carefully rebuild progressive movements in South Africa so that we can contest that power in a meaningful way. Because I think a lot of what progressive movements are doing is, I don't know, I don't want to say quite complaining from the sidelines, but there hasn't been the strong building of the power and the institutions and the movements of the scale needed to really drive change. And so I think we should be honest about that. As the Climate Justice Coalition, we're trying to bring together particular forces to work on a transformative climate justice vision. But I think, even as General Secretary, we recognize that we're still very far from where we need to be to build the sort of counterpower to take on the strength of the minerals energy complex, particularly given, its ties into sort of a neo-colonial global economic structure that requires, major mobilizing, not just domestically, but in terms of global and international justice to think about those international flows of capital, which are particularly important in shaping things like South Africa's just energy transition plan, which has been, dominated by Western donors that have shaped what South Africa's just energy transition looks like, and in some ways enabled this move towards a liberalization of our energy system, particularly if you look to some of the earlier loans from the likes of the World Bank and IMF, which made some of their loans conditional on things like the unbundling of Eskom, austerity budgets, and so on. And then the Just Energy Transition Partnership kind of piggybacks on some of those earlier loans and kind of facilitates that pathway through the flows of capital, even if the loans coming through the Just Energy Transition Partnership itself don't necessarily stipulate those sorts of conditions. They kind of build off the back of some of the previous loans and structural adjustment that arguably did drive South Africa along this path, enabled by local elites that are quite happy to facilitate liberalization because of how it concentrates benefits in the hands of a few. So yeah, I think this kind of gives us hopefully a sense of the landscape of the struggle that we have to reclaim the just transition and the sort of the deep inequalities that we face. And I thought, I started the quote with the talk with a quote from Steve Biko, and I thought I'd end the talk now that I'm at about my 30 minutes, with a quote from Ayanda Kota, who passed away sadly earlier this year, the founder and chairperson of the Unemployed People's Movement, who was a friend of mine and I think quite an inspiration to many in the progressive circles. And he wrote an article during the last elections that I thought I'd quote, and he said, "Democracy is meant to be the will of the masses. Elections should be part of the endless struggle against the powerful minority. For those in power, elections are merely a means to an end. They are viewed as the fora through which people can express their voices. But once concluded, people must be disciplined and must know their place. Under democracy, elections should open up the possibilities for struggle and place the government in the hands of the people." And I think Ayanda's call that, democracy should be a place where elections open up the possibilities of struggle is a good call to us, because I think there is a tendency sometimes in democratic countries to go to the polls and then to call it a day. But I think now more than ever there's the need to mobilize and to build so that we can actually take democracy back into the hands of people and build people's power in a meaningful way so that we can reclaim the state away from serving the interest of the minerals energy complex towards serving the interest of climate justice, of energy justice, and of building a more, just South Africa. And I think the possibilities are really there. Maybe to end on maybe a more positive note is that if you look at the possibilities for South Africa in moving towards green industrialization, into light manufacturing, to thinking more about land transformation and agricultural subsidies and so on, and building an economy that's less dominated by the minerals energy complex and more towards, technologies of the future, particularly if we do so in a way that's just and that's driven by localization, that there is vast economic opportunities that could be, a driver and a key part of the transformation of South Africa's economy away from dependence on such an extractive and rapacious minerals energy complex. And so I think as much as we look at this and we see the sort of state of crisis of the movement, we also see this as an opportunity for a movement to claim those opportunities to build a more socially and ecologically just future. And so, at the Climate Justice Coalition, we have a podcast called Just Us and the Climate, and our tagline is that that climate change is not only a crisis, but it's also an opportunity for us to build a better, more just future. And I think, that really speaks true to the opportunities that we have, is that recognizing that, the climate crisis is incredibly urgent. If you look at the science, it says we need to transform across all sectors of our society within the next few decades to prevent the climate crisis getting much worse and spiraling out of control. And then we also look at the state of South Africa's economy, which is deeply unequal, deeply unjust. And so both the climate science and our social justice moral compass tell us that we need deep transformation in South Africa. And if we can marry those transformation imperatives, it can be the thing that can hopefully drive a rebuilding of progressive movements and bring together forces that don't always see eye to eye, but that maybe could see eye to eye in a more transformative and radical vision for South Africa's future. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to being in discussion.
Thank you so much, Alex, for giving us such an excellent overview and critique, of the just transition discourse or a talk in South Africa. I like how you state that in order for us to have a just transition in South Africa, we really need a deep transformation of society. And I'm glad that Climate Justice Coalition, is part of that transformation. And I also appreciate how you linked pollution or, the extractive nature of the South African economy to, growing inequality in the South African society. Of course, I've always, driven along the N4, and when I pass it, eMalahleni, you can't even breathe there. And I see, the settlements that are surrounded are occupied by poor people. Of course, the burden of pollution is shouldered by the poor. And I also appreciate how you link the mineral energy complex in its current state, in its current form, how you link it to, to the production of, cadre politics, new forms of capitalist accumulation, which are not only spearheaded by white elites, but also by an emerging class of Black elites who are connected to politicians. And lastly, my comment before I take any questions from the audience, I like how you also introduce the land issue. I think it is grossly ignored in this just transition talk. You cannot transition into maybe use of renewable resources. Maybe you want to farm, you want a solar farm, and there is no land to do that. Obvious, at the end of the day, you'll have to go to the same, few farmers that have got land, so that you pay them so that you can put your solar panels and so forth. So are there any questions from the audience or any comments? I see Mohammed joined us late. You're welcome. Shona, you can ask your questions.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thank you, Alex. As always, brilliant presentation. Alex, I just had a couple of things. The first is you spoke about higher rates of electrification following the ANC's. Oh, sorry, I'm just reading this message that's coming up here that's saying it's going to lower my hand. I wondered, it's going to cut me out or kick me off or something. Higher forms of electrification following the ANC coming to power. Does that include people who are tapping in, reconnecting themselves, tapping in like those self-connections? And do we have any sort of stats for those? I mean, perhaps Eskom would have those stats. And then the other question that I had, which you you did touch on this, but here's the thing. I think that in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a shift, certainly amongst, say, could I say this? People in the middle classes who are saying things like, we'd rather have electricity privatized because we don't trust the state. The state is corrupt. They just want to steal all those tenders. And then if you challenge them and say, well, that's going to serve you because you can afford to pay privatized tariffs, etc., they say things like, well, it doesn't seem as if the working classes or the poor are being facilitated anyhow by the state. And, you know, the minute that you're setting up these whole new systems, it's just an opportunity to come in and loot. It's all about the tenders. And so we actually think there would probably be more accountability and a better service if these things were privatized. So I just wonder, like, you did touch on that, but I reckon you coming up against that. And I think that that's the elephant in the room, right? And then the other thing I wanted to ask, sorry, I am abusing my chance to speak because I don't see any other hands up. So I am abusing, Dan. I hope it's okay. I just wondered, I know that you partner horizontally with a number of other progressive movements and organizations. And I just wondered how, you know, how a just transition is viewed in those spaces. I mean, people who, for example, live in informality, are they worried about how energy services are provided? I mean, is it coming from extraction or is it coming from renewables? How do you, I'm asking, how do you build those alliances? What sort of language do you use? What sort of narrative do you use? I'm just wondering what the practical way of organizing and mobilizing across these networks is, if you know what I'm getting at. I'm not being very articulate. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
No, thanks, Shona. Oh, sorry, go for it, Dan.
Okay, Alex, you can respond to the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Stanford and Shona. Stanford, I appreciate the positive commentary, and Shona, thanks for some of those difficult questions. Maybe to start with the easier one, the electrification rate. So I think the electrification stats, and I need to pull those up for you because I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but those are counting those that have been formally connected to the grid. And so it was a really impressive rollout by the ANC in terms of electrification. And so I think that is something that, you know, is one in the early ANC days, at least, something that is worth crediting them for. I'm not sure if there's figures on the sort of the more informal people's connection, as they're called, in terms of how many people are connecting that way, but perhaps Eskom might have those details. But yeah, formal electrification actually, you know, skyrocketed under the ANC from about 1996 until the sort of late 2000s. And so, yeah, really, really impressive progress there, but has stalled and slowed down. And then, yeah, the question of the middle class and privatization, I think, is a very legitimate one. And I think this is where there's the nice quote from Noam Chomsky that Saftu likes to quote. And it says, you know, that's the way that privatization works, is that you underinvest in the public sector, you break things, you make sure that you don't work, you get people angry, and then you hand it over to the private sector. And I think when we look to the history of Eskom, there's this long history of like underinvesting in Eskom, trying to basically open up the space for investment for the private sector. There is the lack of proper maintenance. Then there's like the destruction of Eskom over time, which then does create this sort of drive towards the anger towards the state and state-owned entities and open up the space for privatization. And I mean, the ANC has been planning privatization now for quite a long time. So this is, you know, part of the long play of things. But it doesn't mean that the anger towards the state isn't, I guess, legitimate in a lot of ways in terms of seeing Eskom's failures impacting devastatingly on people. But I think it is a point of relative privilege to say, well, just the private sector is going to deal with it, because we haven't seen the private sector deliver for, you know, low-income households. And so I think there is a real challenge of trying to rebuild trust that the public sector can actually deliver And part of rebuilding that trust is rebuilding the institutions within the public sector that could do that. And it is, I mean, as much as Eskom is in a terrible state now, it is worth recalling that it used to be quite a functional utility. And so, you know, taking a bit of a longer arc of history into mind, recognizing that Eskom can play a positive role. Sorry, I forgot to turn my phone on silent, and I imagine it's causing noise here. Let me do that quick. Pardon me. Yeah, but I think it is. It's if you look at some of the polling, there is a significant desire for the private sector to play more of a role. And so in a sense, I think that public discourse has been lost because of the failures of the public sector. And so I think part of our work ahead is to rebuild trust in the possibility of the public sector delivering, recognizing that so many do depend on it, and that, you know, transition driven by the private sector, certainly under the current parameters that we see, isn't delivering for the vast majority. Yeah. And then you had a third question, which is how is the just transition viewed in other spaces? And it's complex. I think, you know, with the Climate Justice Coalition, we have over 60 member organizations. They come from various different backgrounds. So, for example, we work with those who are fighting around energy justice in townships in Soweto. And there, a lot of the connections are around electricity unreliability, the unaffordability of tariffs. And so there's been big pushback against, you know, the likes of Medupi and Kusile, seeing these as corrupt loans that people are having to pay back in order to benefit the rich, and kind of seeing renewables as an alternative that can deliver power to people in a way that, you know, isn't, you know, driving significant tariff increases and so on. And so, you know, some of the connections are very much about energy poverty. It's about fighting corruption. It's about tariffs. And so I think that's where we get a lot of our entry points. But then, you know, within some of our trade union partners, I think there's a lot of contestation about what the just transition looks like. And I think within the trade union space as well, there's just general divisions that are occurring in terms of how the just transition is seen, with some like NUM and NUMSA. I mean, NUMSA used to be very progressive on this, pushing socially owned renewable energy as a key part of their vision, but they've kind of gone back a little bit and now are quite protective of coal and are not driving that socially owned renewable energy agenda as much. NUM, very much tied to coal interests, talks about clean coal, sounds a lot like Mantashe. They sing from the same song sheet. But there are other leaders within the trade union movement that see the just transition as an opportunity for radical transformation. You speak to the likes of someone like Vavi, for example, he'll talk about the just transition as being a vehicle for radical transformation of the economy, and that being the only way that we can really address the climate and economic crisis. So it's very contested, even in our civil society space. And so a big part of our job as the coalition is to figure out what are the progressive forces we can cobble together, and what are the shared interests that we can drive forward. And a lot of those are around, you know, socially owned renewable energy, around Green New Eskom, and about ensuring major investment in just transition measures to protect workers and communities as the transition happens. So sometimes focusing in on those shared pieces of the agenda so that we can work together. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to say another quick thing. Sorry, Anna, you excuse my reference. When you turned around to get your phone, it looked like you were going into that portal and being sucked in like a Harry Potter movie. I just wanted to tell you that in case you ever wanted to use it in another presentation.
Thank you so much, Alex. Mohammed, your hand is up.
You're on mute, Mohammed.
Sorry, you are muted. Unmute yourself.
Apologies.
Lovely.
Thanks, Danford. Alex, apologies for coming in late. I somehow in my mind thought the presentation was starting at 4:30, something I definitely wanted to attend. Look, I can't necessarily speak for Eskom anymore. I did work there for 22 years. I'm now at UKZN. And from what I got, I think, you understand the space that we're in, but as somebody who straddles both sides almost, from the engineering side and the climate justice side, civil society, I suppose, I see what you're saying. I definitely am a climate evangelist trying to get things across to that side. But we also see the technical sides of things. Like if we kind of move towards a grid that's more driven by renewables, we lose that base load. Trying to keep the grid alive, grid of our size, something like 35 gigawatts is exceptionally complex. Even if you look at cloud cover coming over a solar farm, you may have heard all of these excuses before. I suspect that the trade unions, etc., are backtracking because they realize, and it's something that we often, even in the last presentation we had in this series, I think the presenter spoke about having clean, cheap, always available electricity or something like that. And from an engineering standpoint, you can't have all of those things. And I suspect perhaps that some of the unionists have kind of realized that, look, coal is cheapest in this current climate because ESCOM uses this dirty coal, so to speak of it. And by dirty, we just mean low grade, nothing to do with corruption, etc. But thank you for your presentation. If I could just address perhaps what Shauna was asking about the stats. Since I attend a lot of the humanities kind of presentations, something that I recommend people perhaps do is look at the ESCOM annual report. And a lot of the stats are there, Shauna, in terms of what they call non-technical losses. That's theft. It's very easy for us to determine the amount of theft because we know how much of power we're generating and we know how much of revenue we're collecting. So that's very easy. Privatization makes a lot of sense, but putting on the civil society hat, my fear is that the problem is going to become who looks after the poor. The private sector may not be able to or will not afford that. ESCOM, for example, very famously burns a lot of diesel to keep the lights on to avoid the bad image of load shedding. That is completely financially not feasible from the point of view that you're spending a lot of money to generate power that you're not getting back. So from a business perspective, a private entity won't do that. It has to be the state that will only have that advantage. Danford, if you'd allow me to share my screen, I just want to show you what the new system is going to look like, if you don't mind. Just 1 minute. Is it okay?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Just quickly share.
This is screen 2. All right. So if you guys can see my screen, this is a presentation that was recently publicly shared by the AMEU, which is the Municipal Electricity Utilities Association. And this is the future kind of grid that they're looking at. You can see it looks very complicated. The thing that I'm worried about is these end users. So prosumers are kind of the high income and the middle income earners who have solar panels in their roof and are able to utilize their own power and sell it back, for example. That comes at a huge, obviously, capital cost. Anybody who's installed solar panels and inverters in their house would understand that. So it's not for everybody. I worry in this entire system that it makes sense from a technical point of view, which is the way they're looking at it. I just worry about these end customers because I don't see how they're going to afford. As these prosumers start not relying on ESCOM to generate power for themselves, they're going to start putting less and less into the kitty. And suddenly it's called an energy death spiral. And that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the fact that nobody is going to take care of the poor in this entire argument. So from a just energy transition, that's what keeps me up at night. And if I could just end off by saying perhaps the hope that I see, Alex, is ESCOM and the government have done a lot for electrification. What I'd like to see happen is as we get further and further from the city centers, etc., these power lines get longer and longer. And as they get longer, the costs get more. So there's a break-even point there. And engineers always look at things in terms of equations, etc. But there's a break-even point where it actually becomes cheaper for those communities to function as microgrids. I believe that we're not doing that enough. I think that those poor communities towards the end of the lines needs to be connected directly to renewable. We can then do that in a smaller way and also kind of save the grid. But for me right now, that's the only viable alternative in the short to medium term. But yeah, Alex, sorry, no real questions, but I just wanted to add to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for giving us that technical side of things. If you want to respond to that, Alex.
Sure, happy to do that. Thanks, Mohammed. I think you and I share very similar concerns about the end customers there, particularly the low-income ones. I think that's the really big challenge, is who services them under this sort of more liberalized pathway, and that hasn't been properly answered yet as this unbundling process kind of rushes forward. And I think this is a big part of why we, as the Climate Justice Coalition, are driving this Green New Eskom campaign. It's about ensuring that those end customers aren't left behind as they currently are being. And so we do need an answer to that. And I think it's about reclaiming energy as a public good and as a public service, rather than just as something that is driven by the private sector, often in the name of profits or for those who can afford it. And so that is a big question that we need to be asking as this sort of restructuring of the energy sector takes place. And I think you're right, Eskom is facing a bit of a death spiral, more than a bit, a significant death spiral. And so can we halt that and reverse it by, investing in Eskom, by maintaining and by allowing also Eskom to invest in generation so that it can provide power, and maybe to do so in a way that isn't through necessarily public-private partnerships where they have to, guarantee the profits of particular off-takers, but maybe owning directly renewables as a way of delivering energy too. But then, yeah, that brings me to the more technical question that you were raising about the feasibility of renewables. And I think that you're right. When renewables hit quite a high level of penetration, there is a significant question about, how do we ensure a stable delivery of renewables? I think it's encouraging that we see other quite large electricity grids with much higher levels of renewables energy penetration than South Africa, being able to operate, and, energy storage becoming stronger and stronger, like grids like California, for example, where energy storage is starting to, play a major role in balancing out renewables, along with, transmission lines to help connect to other grids and so on. And so I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done as South Africa deepens its transition to renewables to ensure, that stable energy supply. But I think we are moving, within the energy sector to a point where, and I think I can pull up some studies around this, where, renewables and storage can provide quite a lot of the stable power that we need at a more affordable rate than fossil fuel technologies, just because of the significant cost declines that have occurred within those technologies. And this is even looking at a systems level when thinking about the cost of connection and so on. But there is, when you get to some of the high levels of penetration, there are some questions that need to be asked about how do we ensure investment in sort of stabilizing those high levels of renewables. But I think South Africa is still so very far away from those high levels of renewables, which is not to say we shouldn't be asking those questions, and we need to invest in things, especially around the transmission grid and the transmission, which we don't have sufficient. And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles to large-scale renewables in South Africa, is the failure of the government to invest in transmission to bring renewables from where they are to like the urban centers. And so that's going to be one of our biggest bottlenecks. But investing in things like transmission, like storage, interconnection to other grids, I think are ways of allowing for much higher renewables penetration, and can do so in a way that can help bring costs down relative to investing in new coal or new gas, or trying to, prop up these very old coal plants, which are becoming incredibly uneconomical in terms of the amount of money that would need to be poured into them, both to maintain them, but also to update them so that they're compatible with clean energy standards. Yeah, which is quite interesting. The former Eskom CEO talked a lot about actually to try and upgrade the old coal grid the old coal plants would cost something like 300 billion to make them compatible with the minimum emission standards. And his argument was that, it would be much more cost effective to invest in renewables and storage instead and ramp that up more quickly. Of course, he didn't quite get to see out that vision given his rather dramatic departure from Eskom. But yeah, I think
I just want to comment quickly, if you don't mind, just to say, I
Yeah.
think we agree on a lot more than we disagree on. But
Yeah.
it's not just the generation cost. I'm currently doing a report because Mittal steel is thinking of closing down, for example, and we're going to have to now start importing our steel. Part of the
Right.
process going forward, you'll see, is that Eskom Transmission need to build 10,000 kilometers of line. And as most of you would know, these lines include a lot of steel. So, you know, we're going to be importing the steel at the same time that China is facing pressures to make their steel more green. So, you know, like I feel sometimes we look at the generation costs and we forget that there's additional cost involved in terms of the transmission and distribution of this new power source, this new I want to say bilateral, but, you know, it's going both ways. So as I always say, and everybody, I suppose, in this forum knows, it's just, I just think of it as being very, very complicated. I'm somebody who likes to know all the kind of variables, and there's just so many variables that it's impossible. But thanks.
Yeah, thanks, man. But no, I agree. The system costs are much more complicated. But I do think there is some good analysis looking at system-wide costs and comparing that to a fossil fuel, the sort of status quo, recognizing that even with the system costs, that it would be a more affordable future. But yeah, I agree. It's a lot more complicated than just the generation to make that.
One of the ways we could do it is we don't look at it as South Africa alone, and I think people have spoken about this. We need to look at international borders, you know, so we need to work with the other. Would Mozambique is building a new hydropower plant like Cahora Bassa, for example, and we utilize that kind of variability. So when we don't have enough sunshine, perhaps we can take from our neighbors, and when they don't have, likewise.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Southern African power pool, I think, will come into the fore once we move to a more renewable dominated system. Sort of, yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. You know, I was listening from the other side, Alex and Mohammed discussing. It's so insightful and very informative. Are there any questions before we close? I think we are almost 4 minutes after 5.
Can I just ask Mohammed if he knows from his friends at Eskom if load shedding is going to start again on Monday or something?
Yeah, you're still going to go onto YouTube. I'm just checking before I answer. No, look, to be fair, I've seen the stats, and everybody always talks about the fact that it was done because of you know, the elections coming up, etc. Unless somebody is really fudging the numbers, it was very reasonable as to why we didn't have load shedding over the elections. Eskom traditionally doesn't do load shedding or doesn't take out their power plants for maintenance over the winter break because we realize that we need it. So we generally take out our power plants for maintenance in summer. Hence, you'll always find an increase in those months where you have a lot of load shedding. What happens is we take out 4 or 5 plants, and then another 4 or 5 plants go out on unplanned maintenance, you know, where they have a breakdown. And then we have a big loss. The sad truth is that people are not mentioning is the reason why we don't have load shedding. Load shedding is basically how much of power do you have, how much of power do you need, and you need to maintain this balance. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is the balance has kind of come down because due to load shedding, etc., a lot of businesses have closed down. So a lot of the demand is gone. A lot of people have gone off the grid. A lot of the demand is gone. So, you know, it's not just that the generation has suddenly, look, the energy availability factor has really gone up. It was really bad at one stage. It's now around 75%. So, yeah, I don't know when it's coming back, Shauna. I suspect it will. I think for the next few years, everybody said, even the Eskom people, that it's here for a while. But I don't think it's as sinister as people assume that it was only an election ploy.
Oh, that's good to hear. Okay, thank you for that, Mohammed.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Alex. That was a really amazing presentation.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation. Good to chat
Thank
to
you
all.
so much, Alex. I think we've really learned a lot. I think the last speaker, you just continued with the same trajectory. We had Trevor Ngwane as our previous speaker. He talked about energy racism and so forth, and it sort of fits into some of the arguments that you were making here. So we appreciate that, and I hopefully will catch up soon. And please be on the lookout for other seminars in the same series. I'll add you in our mailing list if you don't mind.
Yes, please do add me. I'd love
And,
to. I'd love to attend, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to chat to you all today.
Yes. Shona, do you want to maybe make some closing remarks and then we just wrap it up? Thanks,
No,
Alex. I'll see you soon.
I'm good. I just to say thanks to everybody, and I hope we can keep the conversation going. And these seminars are going to go up on YouTube for anyone who missed the first part, or anybody who wants to join in later. If there's anybody that I know a couple of people who aren't here, and they will look it up on YouTube. So thank you to everyone for participating. Alex, good to see you. Mohammed, good to engage with you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank
have a
you.
good
Bye,
day.
everyone.